In this video, we're going to cover the economics of the Olympics. This is a good transition lecture for us because we've covered opportunity cost and cost benefit analysis. Here we're going to take those things and apply them to some of the most common and important topics in sports economics by way of introduction. So what are we going to do in this lecture? We're going to cover the cost of hosting the Olympics, the short-run benefits of hosting the Olympics, any long-run benefits of hosting the Olympics. Then we're going to ask the question, why is it that countries continue to host the Olympics? And you'll see why that's an important question once we get through the costs and benefits in sections 1, 2, and 3. And then once we cover that, we're going to talk about some potential solutions to the economic viability problem. This comes from a paper of the same title by Bade and Matheson, published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2016. So what are the costs of hosting the Olympics? Well, the Summer Olympics started back in 1896, and host cities have been selected roughly every 7 years prior to the event that the selected host country would host. Host cities end up responsible for the full cost of the Olympics. This is one of the real drivers here. Historically, right, rich, developed nations have been the ones to host. Between 1896 and 1998, basically all host countries were from Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, and Japan. Of course, these are the most developed and highest GDP nations in the world, especially during this time period. However, in 1998 and going forward, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC henceforth, has encouraged more developing countries to bid. Prior to 98, about 18% of countries that were bidding were what we would call developing, and the bids after this time period, they're actually about 50-50 between developing and developed countries. Now, this is interesting because bidding is expensive. An example here is that Chicago spent between $70 and $100 million in a bid that did not win the Olympics in 2016. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars potentially spent to attract the Olympics, and you spend that whether you win it or not. Broadly, costs fall into three categories. They're general infrastructure costs, specialized sport infrastructure, and operational costs. So you're going to have a big influx of athletes, coaches, tourists, and of course spectators. You're going to have the infrastructure to host that in your city. More on that in a moment. Of course, you also have very specific sports and athletes with specific needs, and so you're going to have literally places to hold the events for the Olympics, and then of course running the Olympics has its own costs as well. Okay, so let's get into these each in turn. The general infrastructure costs, one of the primary things is that you have to have enough hotel room. You have to be able to absorb the number of people. Of course, historically, this is done almost exclusively through hotels and hotel rooms, and the IOC prefers that you have at least 40,000 excess capacity of hotel rooms in order to host. In 2016, for example, Rio, in a developing country, ended up having to build 15,000 hotel rooms in order to meet this minimum number that the IOC wants you to have. In 1994, Norway had built on some excess hotel capacity, and subsequent to the games, 40% of those hotels ended up failing, right? So you're reaching a peak demand that is not going to be met again, and so you're really messing with the hospitality industry, both in the run-up to the games and following the games. You then also have to have an Olympic Village on top of the hotels, right? You have to have an Olympic Village that has a capacity of 15,000, so no small feat in and of itself. And of course, you have to have the transportation facility. So you have to have the highway infrastructure, you have to have the bus or the rail, etc., for you to be able to host the games and the volume of traffic that ends up coming with it. Okay. Next, you have to have specialized sport infrastructure, right? So you have many obscure events in track and field. Of course, we talked a little bit about the Summer Olympics, but the Winter Olympics, we also have some really high profile examples of this. But it's not just that you have these really specialized sports that maybe only a small population of people, even in a large city, might be playing. But when you collect up all the practitioners at the highest level of these particular sports, you're going to have much more, much higher need for a very specialized infrastructure for these events. The problem is, right, it's not just that you have the infrastructure, but you also need a large viewing area, right? So even if you have the right arena, even if you have the right field, all those things, they're often not going to be situated in a way that's going to allow for a lot of fans, coaches, other athletes to come and watch those particular events, right? And you're going to want to be able to televise that as well, right? So most cities, even the size of cities, the massive cities that are hosting these events, they just don't have these kind of facilities, right? So you're going to have the field, the infrastructure itself, the large viewing areas, and then you're going to need to potentially expand those arenas, right? Modern football and soccer stadiums, for example, are not often compatible with the full-size Olympic track, right? So if we think of like classic American high school fields, a lot of times there's a track around that. In professional settings or other settings like that, we separate those two things so that the stadium seating can be closer to the field of play, allowing for a better view. But then you don't have that kind of track and field setup, that classic setup that you're going to need for the Olympics. Finally, we have operational costs. And these come in several different forms. The obvious one is just you literally have to manage the events, right? Opening and closing ceremonies, and very importantly, security, right? Olympics have long been a target for terrorism, and there's actually been attacks, not just attacks, but attacks that have killed people. 1972 Munich and 1996 Atlanta are probably the two classic examples. In the post-2001 era, where we've had the September 11 events and other major terrorist attacks, security costs have actually even increased, even though to this point the Olympics have not been a target again, not successfully been a target again of terrorist attacks. So you've got these three huge cost categories, each with very specific and very large costs. We're talking about quite a large spending. For example, the security following the 1996, when the games were held in Athens, the Athens security cost was over $1 billion. So we're talking about just enormous costs, even for large cities. Remember, the cities are bearing the entire cost of hosting. Okay. And of course, right, often the costs that are being listed here are much larger than what end up being budgeted for, right? So we have an enormous cost overrun as well. Let's turn and look at some of the short-run benefits or possible short-run benefits. So, organizing committees, which are the committees that are representing the city, they argue that hosting gives the host cities short-run benefits. And they argue these come in three broad categories, and that is construction, tourism during the games, and then, of course, revenue from the games, right? So, the revenue from the games comes in several forms, but the important thing is that the IOC, the Olympic Committee, is actually controlling a lot of these revenues, and they determine what those are going to look like. Okay, so one of the things is sponsorships associated with the games. Very high profile event, so sponsorships are very important. A good example of this is like the London 2012 events that you've got both international and domestic sponsors that add up to about $1.5 billion in total revenue. Some of these numbers are estimated, obviously. Of course, then these are sponsorship revenues are split between the IOC and the hosting city. Ticket sales and licensing, which are probably in the ballpark of $1 billion in revenue each, go to the host city. And then the big one, of course, is media. And TV rights now are probably around half of total revenues. And the IOC gives the host city less than a third, less than 30% actually, of these revenues, right? So it's the direct revenues, even if I added all these up and end up giving them to the host city, they're actually a fraction of the total cost, right? So I'm saying numbers that, okay, sponsorships $1 billion, tickets and licensing $1 billion, media rights, just enormous amount of money, $2 to $3 billion. These are actually less than the total cost that we were covering a moment ago. And again, it's very important to reiterate that the International Olympic Committee is controlling these revenues. And so they could more generously subsidize cities to try to defray some of the cost of hosting the tournaments, but they don't tend to do that. And then you've got the games themselves, but even like hosting the committee members for the IOC to review your city as a potential bid is a lavish expense in and of itself. And so the IOC is benefiting a lot from doing this, and they're not that interested in helping or offsetting the costs of the host cities. Okay, so let's look at how some of these benefits, remember we just said construction, tourism, and revenue. Let's look at some of these in turn. Let's start with construction, right? So large public works can lead to short-run increase in economic activity, right? So the problem with this line of argumentation is that this is very dependent on labor and market capital slack. So think back to your macroeconomics principles class. And if you've got a lot of slack, if there are workers to be hired and there's capital, so the tools of construction, if those are not being used, then you can have a short-run increase in economic activity due to a large public work construction project. The problem is, in the type of countries that historically have hosted, you have very low slack. And what that means is when you're going to go and try to hire workers to do the construction, when you're going to use the tools of construction that are going to be used in order to produce things, if there's low slack, you're competing for those resources in the private market, and you will drive the prices of those things up. Right, so the costs will go up for both your project and the private projects that you're competing with, right? Now, the good thing is in developing countries, in poorer countries, there's slack typically, but you have the opposite problem there where there's budget constraints. And now the governments that are trying to do these things don't have the fiscal capacity to spend billions and billions, $10 billion or more on building an Olympic village and infrastructure and making sure that there are more hotels built, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, this construction is the same as any expansionary fiscal policy that would be happening. As a consequence, it's subject to the usual considerations for a fiscal policy decision, right? So there's generally going to be two effects that come from that. And those two effects are redistribution and crowd out. So in a setting where you're going to have some winners and some losers, from this event happening, and there's going to be construction, and some people are going to pay for that, right? The construction companies, the hospitality industry, etc., they benefit enormously. They're getting to build huge arenas, hotels, highway projects, and of course, the losers, if you will, are those who are in the tax base, because they're the ones paying the bill, right? So the people paying and the people benefiting are they're not one to one. They are not the same. The other big problem is crowd out, and we'll have more on this later, but I want to introduce this idea. It's a very important idea in economics, and that is when government spending and borrowing competes with private spending and investment, therefore raising prices and interest rates. That should say interest rates, not investment. As a consequence, expansionary fiscal policy reduces private spending and investment, right? So we increase the amount of economic activity through government activity, but as a consequence, we decrease economic activity in the private sector. And of course, private sector economic activity is better. And the reason that it's better because it's guided by the market and it's voluntary, as opposed to government action, which of course is funded and driven by a political process rather than a market process. So one of the big problems with thinking about expansionary fiscal policy as potentially a good thing is locations are decided 7 years or more before the event's happening. Does a city, does a region need expansionary or fiscal policy is a hard enough question in the present. It's a difficult question even in a congressional session, whether which way they should go and what does the local economy need. Even if I'm in real time making that decision. Now imagine trying to make that decision, estimating it out seven years in advance when a lot of these construction projects are going to be underway and being finished, right? So when a government agrees to host, it cannot know if it would benefit or be hurt by expansionary fiscal policy that's going to happen in those 7 years. So it's really going to be a guessing game. At best, it works out, and you need expansionary fiscal policy. There's a little bit of slack. The government has the budgetary room. You're going to have minimal crowd out. There's going to be people that are looking for work, and it all works out. The problem is, of course, if you're wrong about that, then you are actually retarding the growth that could be happening, and you're losing out on long-term benefits in that case. Let's turn now to economic impact studies. This is actually, so I don't work on the Olympics in particular, but we'll cover this more later on in the class. This is the kind of work that I do. This is a huge section of my personal research. Now, I want to talk about studies that are happening before the games. Notice I got a little typo here. Before the games. Some studies estimate large economic gains from hosting. They say, if we host, we'll get these big gains. Okay, these are consulting firms, right? And they come up with very large estimates. Here's a few. 2010 Vancouver Winter Games, $10 billion. 2002 Salt Lake, $4.8 billion. 1996 Atlanta, $5.1 billion. These are estimates before. And they're saying, okay, you're going to get huge numbers of jobs, 35 to 240,000 jobs. Now, there's an obvious problem with this that I'm sure you thought of as soon as I started talking about this, which is that consulting firms and governments are motivated to find large positive impacts, right? The governments want to do these kind of projects and therefore want justification for that. And consulting firms hired by these governments, they're not being hired to find pessimistic results. Now, there are some academic studies that don't have these same kind of motivational problems that estimate maybe small economic gains from hosting before the games then are hosted. For example, a good academic study done on prior to the 2012 London Games said you might get $2 billion in economic impact and maybe 8,000 jobs, right? So notice that this number is smaller than all of these, and this number is way smaller than all of these estimates, right? So these are academic economists who do these kind of things, are good at these kind of things, saying you could have some small economic gains. Okay, now you might be looking at this number and saying, "Wait, small and 2 billion doesn't make sense to me." Just think about the sheer size of a city like London, right? That is a relatively small amount of the total economic activity that's going to be happening in a city of that size. Not trivial, right? Just small. Okay. However, the important ones, the after the fact studies, show economic impacts are actually very near zero. And obviously, even when they're not zero, they're just a small fraction of what was predicted beforehand. Let's go through a few of those. We'll start with the Bade and Matheson one, since that's the same authors of that we're following here. They show the 84 summer games and the 96 summer games created 5,000 and 3,000 jobs, respectively. Well, okay, so maybe in the range of 3 to 42,000. So compare that 5,000 to we can even just take that middle number there and say something like 20,000 jobs compared to the kind of jobs that we're looking at. It's lower than the lowest estimates that we're showing by consulting firms. Jasmine and Manning show in 1972 no impact in employment on the host region, right? So one of the interesting things maybe is, and that's why a study like this one is so important, is right? It's not just a city; it's a whole region. People might be going to other cities in the area, and then supporting tourism and hospitality and infrastructure jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I'm going to pick it up just a little bit. So here's another one that studies the 96 games, right? No impact on taxable sales, no impact on hotel occupancy, no impact on airport usage. Now, remember, you were saying, well, there's this big event and all of this traffic is happening. How is it that there can be no impact? Hold on to that thought because I'm going to get into that next. Okay, another Bade and Matheson paper looks at the 2002 Winter Olympics. Remember, we had the pre-estimates here. Taxable sales in restaurants by 70 million, not 70 billion, and taxable sales in general actually down. So it seems there's a little transfer from general merchandisers to restaurants. This is actually very similar to the nature of the type of research that I do, which is no coincidence because obviously I work based on a lot of the work that these guys have done. Okay, Gesicki and Madden, the 2000 Summer Olympics, household consumption in Australia down $2 billion. Bauman and Matheson, 2002 Winter Games, increase in employment of 4,000 to 7,000 jobs compared to a prediction of 35,000, right? So remember, that's that one, right? Maybe a tenth of the projected economic impact. Okay, a couple more studies, again, two more on 96. This one says 300,000 jobs. So that is that's actually doing better, right? And a actually increase in the employment growth rate. During the Olympics themselves, 30,000. So what's happening here? Well, what we're looking at is, with these studies, what's the total economic impact? Like, how is that economy changed, right? And so you've got this one-time event, but then we're looking at the whole scope of the economy and then what happens in the years following, right? Of course, we wouldn't want to be so myopic as to only study that one point in time when the event happened, but we want to study what would happen all the way across the economy. Okay, so if this is true, why do before the game studies end up failing? Well, the obvious one is vested interest. They have unrealistic assumptions, and these predictions are very sensitive to those assumptions. Okay, so if I had asked you, there's a group of people doing a study, and it's their job to find good results because that's what they want to hear and the people that hire them want to hear, do you expect their estimations and predictions to be too optimistic? You would obviously say yes. Now, alongside that, though, are very important methodological problems, right? They ignore the substitution effect. What happens is local residents shift their spending. The most classic case of this is actually the 2002 Salt Lake, right? Where, and there are actually some positive effects in Salt Lake. So I don't want to paint like a completely negative picture, but one aspect of what happened in 2002 with Salt Lake is that, yes, there was this huge bump in the high profile, the how many people knew about skiing in Salt Lake, for example. But what happened was this increased tourism then made it harder for people that lived in the region to get on the slopes, right? There's only so much, right? If there are 50,000 skiers throughout the skiing season, and then 50,000 more people discover it, the total is not going to be 100,000 skiers, right? Because the increased crowding and number of people are going to decrease what happens, right? So local residents then change their behavior and end up doing less or doing other things, or they themselves, they say, well, it used to be this was a best kept secret in the Salt Lake area was the skiing, and so now I travel somewhere else to do some of my skiing, and so it spreads out that spending. Okay, so this is what we call the substitution effect. This is very important, right? And then, of course, crowd out, which we've already discovered. Remember, we framed crowd out in the context of government spending, but crowd out can also happen in terms of personal and individual choices, right? So if we're have more hotels, we have fewer space for other things. We have less dedicated activity in the economy to other things. So that is going to crowd out what is happening. And the nice thing about the market, right, is that relative prices guide this process, and the different dynamic changes that happen because of that happen based on the needs and wants, desires, and resources of the people in the market. If you have government activity that's doing these things, it does not necessarily reflect those things. Finally, before the game, studies fail because of their choice of the multiplier. So what's the multiplier? The multiplier is the idea that output increases by a multiple of the original change in spending. And the reason for this is because one person's spending is another person's income. So if we have $100,000 in new spending on hotels, that becomes income to the hotel owners, to the people that get jobs because of that. They get income because of that, and they go spend on other things, right? They buy cars and pay mortgages, they buy food, etc., right? So there's this positive pattern to economic activity. We always want more economic activity because we can have this kind of effect. The problem, however, is that this is that assumption, and that high sensitivity is often has to do with this multiplier. So if I say, oh, there's going to be 100, well, what would be a good number here? $1 billion in economic activity that's going to be created by this, and then we choose a multiplier of 4, then we're going to get a total economic activity of $4 billion. The problem is you need to root what this number is in reality, and they consulting firms and government studies often choose numbers like 2 or 4. Actually, 2 and 4 are what Bade and Matheson say, and that might be specifically true in the case of the Olympics because they're experts on this topic. But when we do other studies, when we do other types of economic impact studies before the actual construction, the public work project, etc., this number can be as high as 10. So when we see potential baseball stadiums, when we see downtown revitalization projects, a lot of times those are using multipliers as high as 10. I've actually personally firsthand seen studies that do exactly that. And, that's just a irresponsible type of number to choose. Now, what number should be picked? Well, this is an excellent question. We actually, right, so a multiplier of 1 means a 1-to-1 return if there's 100,000 in spending. In situations where the crowd out is very high, we can actually have even less than 1. And this multiplier, the government spending multiplier, in practice in the United States, for the whole country, that's actually a number less than 1. So if the government spends $100 billion on a project, the impact on the economy, when economists have estimated this, is less than $100 billion because the multiplier is often closer to 0.25 than it is to 1. And so, what is this type of number for a city, for a region instead of the United States government? Of course, this is a very complex problem that has to do with how many things are in a local economy. So, a huge city like London, Chicago, that we've talked about, they're going to have very large, diverse economies. So, there will be more crowd out. In relatively smaller places like Salt Lake City, you'll have a less diverse economy, which means there will be what we call more leakage, right? So, if I'm a hotel owner, my income went up, and then I want to buy high-end car now. If I'm in London or Chicago, I can get that in the city that I'm in. If I'm in Salt Lake City, perhaps that really fancy car that I want, I have to go to Los Angeles to pick that up. Okay, so that's just a preview of all the different things that might be at play in this situation. But a multiplier much closer to 1, I would probably guess in the case of an Olympics, we might want to choose 1.25 or something like that, a very small multiplier type effect. Okay, so now I've covered short run benefits. Let's take a look at what I'll call potential long run benefits. Okay, so obviously, one is the legacy of the sporting facilities. So you build these new sports facilities. Now people who play those particular sports in that city have better, larger facilities. This is a pretty small effect, but it's probably real, right? It's just your local curling team that now has a nice curling arena is going to benefit, but you're talking about a small number of people in most of these situations. Now, one of the things that's important, and this will be reiterated when we get to this at later points in this class, is that is just fundamentally the nature of sports facilities, because you have relatively large, very specific facilities that just cannot be used at a high utilization rate, right? Because we want our sporting events to be played at particular times in particular seasons. Let's think about what's some of the absolute highest use cases. Well, of course, the most games in sort of traditional sports that we would think about is baseball, and we've got 81 games being played in a large stadium. It's just very difficult for sport facilities unless there is extremely peculiar organization to be able to host a bunch of games, right? Even if we have one football arena for all the high school teams in a relatively large city, obviously scheduling is going to be a problem in that case. But even if we're doing that, right, we're playing 10 or 12 high school games, and half of those being home games, and then we're looking at, even if you have 5 or 6 local high schools sharing a football facility, which never happens, right? You're only looking at a couple dozen games being played, right? So now imagine that in the case of Summer Olympic field and track events, Winter Olympic, less popular, especially in the host city a lot of times, events, it's going to be even smaller number of people and spectators that are going to be watching. A more high-profile argument is, investments in general infrastructure might provide long-term benefits. The problem, of course, is it's not obvious why investment done for the Olympics would be better than just the infrastructure work we could have done anyways. Now, there's only one potentially good answer to that, and that is, well, it's difficult to motivate the spending that's necessary. There's this political capital argument. But of course, the Olympics is not a good answer to that, right? You're saying I need a relatively small intervention to get good infrastructure. Now we're going to take on this huge project. That's obviously, best case scenario, a mismatch of scale, right? So maybe the most popular one is the media attention surrounding the games can promote future tourism in that host city. This would be the idea of putting a city on the map, right? The general problem with that is, of course, cities big enough to host are also already on the map. I mean, how many of the cities that we've talked about today you haven't heard of before, right? So, let's take a look at um, some cities that hosted Seoul, Barcelona, Atlanta, Sydney, Athens, Beijing, London, Rio, right? The Summer Olympics are not being hosted at places you've never heard of, right? Winter Olympics, there's a little more of that, right? Salt Lake City, Vancouver, Sochi, etc., right? And there are even some smaller towns, cities that end up being hosts. But in general, London is not really becoming more famous because it hosts the Olympics. It hosts the Olympics because it's already famous, right? There are a couple of examples, very important examples, where we see cities benefit from this kind of effect. And that's Salt Lake City, which had a 20% increase in skiers, and Barcelona, which went from 13th to 5th in tourism in Europe following that 1992 Summer Olympic event. Okay. And then, of course, a similar one is that it might be the case that foreign direct investment and international trade might be improved by hosting the Olympics, right? So you host the Olympics, then people that are wanting to trade across country lines or wanting to invest in other places, looking for places to put their money, they might see you, right? So you'd have already been seen by people in your own city and your own nation, but now perhaps the international community becomes more aware of you. The sort of counter argument, if you will, to that is that both winning and failing bids tend to see a 20%, a very large increase in exports, so they tend to do business. But how do we explain the Olympics benefiting you if you made a bid and failed? And the answer to that are two potential reasons. One is, maybe a little bit more positive interpretation, which is even by failing to get the Olympics, you send out a signal. And people see, oh, Chicago, they tried and failed to get the Olympics, but that tells us something about where that city is at and what they're trying to do. And they have this infrastructure money that they want to spend. So Chicago's a good place to invest. That could very well be true. Of course, one maybe obvious one is just reverse causation, right? So maybe it's not that bidding for the Olympics promotes foreign direct investment and increased international trade. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's because you're in a place to attract more foreign direct investment, and you've got the kind of economy that's going to have more international trade, also puts you and your government in a place to bid for the Summer Olympics. This is a very obvious and appealing explanation. Okay, so it's kind of bleak, right? Enormous costs, and then you've got this infrastructure that probably you can't do terribly much with, and you've got prime space that's now dedicated to an Olympic Village, huge outlays, and you're not getting that much of the revenue, and the economic impact studies are pretty bleak. So if it's the case that the Olympics are unlikely to provide benefits, why are cities so eager to host it, right? Well, one answer is in public choice. Even if the net effects are zero, some people win and some people lose, right? And it might be the case that the winners might have the kind of political pull to encourage a city to attempt to host. A good example of this is Boston's failed 2024 bid. Guess who backed that bid? Of course, it's heavy construction and hospitality, the two industries that we've been talking about the most. It is not local mom and pop restaurants. It is not merchandise sales. It's not car sales. It's not grocery stores that are trying to get a city to host the Olympics. It's people that want to build stadiums and people that want to run hotels, right? Of course, another potential reason is it just may be the case that economic concerns are not the key decision for the host cities, right? It might be that if I'm the mayor of Boston or Chicago, that I want it as part of my legacy that I brought the Olympics to my city. And that, of course, is not necessarily the best motivation. But it is the kind of motivation we could see political leaders having. It can also just be the case that the city wants it or the nation wants that hosting, right? And we've got this pride in who we are and being able to host the Olympics, right? You could imagine this if you were a local leader and the Olympics came to your city, you would be very honored, and there would be nothing wrong with that if we set aside the economic considerations. Third is an idea from economic auction theory called the winner's curse. And the winner's curse says that when bidding for an asset of uncertain value, the winner will tend to be the bidder who is most prone to overestimating the value. So we'll see cases of this, right? Things like oil leases and like resources that's hard to gauge how much of the resource is going to be available in a particular lease. We see this activity very, very frequently. But which country or which city is most likely to host? And the answer to that simply is going to be whichever group of consultants advise their government, and that government then believes the consulting firm, that it'll have the biggest effect, right? So if I'm in Oklahoma City and I hire consultants and the consultants say this will bring $1 billion in economic growth to your city, and somebody else is in Memphis and their consultants tell them it's going to bring $2 billion worth of growth to your city, Memphis is more likely to be the one that's willing to do what it takes to wow and to woo the IOC and get the Olympics. Okay, so the Olympic Games as currently constructed are not economically viable. Too high of infrastructure costs, there are monopoly rents to the IOC, poor management, corruption, unreasonable economic expectations. What can we do about that? Well, there's two real broad potential solutions to that. And one is a reformation of the bidding process. How is this going to happen? It's against the IOC's interest to do that. But if we could wave a magic wand and make that happen, then we would see quite a bit of change in this, because we would really remove many of the incentives to have the kind of problems that we end up having in this situation. And maybe a more pragmatic solution is just have some permanent locations and get rid of this one-time use nature of the Olympics, as opposed to we go to one city, we build an Olympic village, we never revisit it. You could have a set of locations. You could have 4 locations, and every one of them hosts every 16 years or something like that. And then you can sort of geographically spread those out to where, it's not conferring, too much of a specific advantage to particular athletes in particular places in the world. Of course, there are good counter arguments to that. Some people might point out if you just have a handful of locations, the athletes that are in those cities might have an enormous benefit, right? We know home field advantage is a real thing in sports. Knowing your stadium, knowing your field, knowing your track. So there might have to be some unusual rules surrounding that kind of thing. But it would certainly defray the costs, which are a fundamental problem in the economics of hosting the Olympics.